Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the first day of AMA's Design Thinking Virtual Conference. So before we kick things off, I do just want to cover a couple of housekeeping items. So all of our sessions will be available on demand following each presentation. So you'll have the opportunity to watch these again and take additional notes. I encourage you all to ask any questions that you have. You can use our Q&A chat that's located right at the bottom of where the slides are. We will have a Q&A session. And of course, continue to use our chat to add your comments and network with your peers. And lastly, I do have to give a shout out. It is my mom's birthday, so happy birthday, Mama. And with that, I'd like to welcome our speaker. So we're thrilled to have Anna Love Mickelson with us, and she is the Executive Education Coach at the D School at Stanford University, and she is a designer at Stoked, and she will be talking to us about design thinking for marketers and introduction. So I will turn it over to her now to officially get us started.
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this beautiful Tuesday morning. We've been watching the introductions come through, and we have quite an incredible group of people from around the world. So I feel honored to be spending the next hour with you talking about human-centered design or design thinking. Kind of use those terms interchangeably. So as Selma mentioned, I am the co-founder of a company called Stoked, and we focus on teaching and practicing design thinking entirely, full-time in all kinds of different contexts. So before we get started today, I would love to just get a sense of your familiarity with human-centered design and how many of you have practiced it before in some capacity. So I have a couple of polling questions for you. The first question is, I'd love to know how many of you are completely new to design thinking or human-centered design. How many of you are here and this is like your first introduction? Which is totally okay. You're starting at the right spot if that's the case. Okay, I'll give you a couple more seconds here just to click the radio button and let me know. Okay, I'm going to, this is kind of fun. I get to like reveal results with these. So it looks like we're, about half and half. So many of you are completely new to design thinking, but we have about 41% of folks who have had some familiarity in the past. So here's my next question. For those of you that have had familiarity, how many of you have had training, some level of training on how to do it? Could be anything from a 2-hour crash course to a week-long design sprint cycle. Okay, let's see here. Another couple of seconds. And I'm going to progress it again. Let's see what we have. Okay, so for those of you that are familiar, about 2/3 have had training on how to do it, and 1/3 you're busy kind of learning as you go. And maybe that's why you're here today and tomorrow. Okay, last question. For those of you that are familiar, how many of you have applied it at work in some way? And it doesn't even have to be a full cycle. It could just be just one element. Maybe it was practicing empathy interviews or building a prototype with somebody to experiment with a new idea. Okay. Okay, here we go. So about 54% have practiced it in some capacity at work, and 46% have not. So this is perfect. This is, it helps me know kind of how we're coming in. So our focus today is going to be really high level. We are really going to look at what is design thinking or human-centered design, and what are the fundamental elements of it. Also, we're going to kind of talk through those fundamental elements by sharing stories and telling you and showing you how other organizations have used human-centered design, both for experience design as well as for marketing and advertising campaigns. And then lastly, we're actually going to help you put a plan in place. So that last polling question where we asked how many of you have applied it at work, my goal is for all 498 of you to be able to say, yes, I have applied an element of design thinking at work. Successfully or unsuccessfully, but you've practiced it, which is the goal. As Selma mentioned, I am the co-founder of an organization called Stoked. And Stoked practices human-centered design or design thinking full-time. We do it with product design. We do it to reimagine performance management. We use it to reimagine culture, to create strategies, to create marketing campaigns. And the reason that it's so kind of applicable across the board to companies of all kinds and of all sizes internationally is because it is a reliable way to uncover new solutions for messy problems. Really, design thinking is just an innovation process. And it is rooted in empathizing with the people that are impacted by the process that you're looking at. And then by empathizing with people, you uncover meaningful challenges that are worthy of your time and worthy of effort to solve. And then in an iterative way, you prototype and test solutions. And so human-centered design is really it's actually a simple process, but over many years of practicing in all of these different industries, we've learned a few things about what makes it successful within teams and organizations and where challenges arise. And the first one is that innovation or success using design thinking is really, it is a byproduct. Success is a byproduct of a great culture. And so we can teach you tools. We could teach you like Six Sigma or any other tool set. You can teach the tools. But with design thinking, the behaviors are just as important as the tools. And so we're going to spend some time actually talking through what those behaviors are. The most important element to successful design teams is actually the culture that they're trying to work within. And the good thing is culture is just made up of people. It's us. And so we're the ones that get to make up that culture and get to create that environment. And so half of the battle is just knowing what the behaviors are that help to enable successful innovation. The second thing is that transformation, whether it's on a project or within an organization, it really begins with self-awareness. Design thinking is a team sport. It's really hard to do alone. And so usually we do it in, groups of 4 to 6 to 12 people. And being really aware of what I'm bringing to the design project, to the team, is incredibly powerful. And it's not only like the attributes that I'm bringing, but where am I swimming upstream? Where am I bringing things that are unhelpful? And creating an environment that allows for that self-awareness actually enables the transformation that allows for innovation. And then this last one is that design unlocks creativity. If we're going to design something that's never been done before, if we're going to create a brand new campaign or a new product or create a brand new experience, that's kind of, it's scary. And it requires a person to show up fully, which means we have to bring our creative self to that project. I've a number of times heard research about that's been conducted in elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, and then in corporate America. And they look at how many people feel creative. How many people feel like they are able to show up in a creative way? And what the research shows is that when you're in first grade, every single hand goes up. They all do. And by the time we reach fifth grade, about half the hands go up. And then by the time you're in the working world, it's a much smaller percentage. There's a great researcher. Well, he was the fellow who led the design program at Stanford. His name was Bob McKim. And for many years, he had all of his classes when they first came together at the beginning of the quarter to do a really short activity. And the activity was 20 seconds. He would have them all with like a piece of paper and a Sharpie. And he would say, okay, I'm going to give you 20 seconds and you are going to draw a portrait of the person sitting next to you. Okay, ready, set, go. And immediately he would push them into this activity and they would sketch and draw this really crummy portrait. And then he would ask them to show it to the person that they sketched. And everybody would show their picture and there would be giggles and there would be laughter. And he would almost always hear an apology and I'm sorry. And what Bob McKim began to notice is that laughter, it was a nervous laughter and they were apologies. And that was actually a little bit of fear, a fear of showing unfinished work to a peer, or to someone, that you might respect, or maybe someone you don't know. But the challenge is that the minute fear enters the equation, it causes our thinking to be small. It causes us to put barriers up to protect ourselves. And when you're doing innovation work, when you're practicing design thinking, we need our thinking to be big and open, which means we need to keep that fear in check so that we can unlock that creativity. So what is human-centered design? What is design thinking? It's really just this set of tools and a set of behaviors. And the tools, they fall into these 5 buckets. Now, on this slide, we have the buckets numbered just because it's easy to refer to that way, but it really isn't a process. It's just 5 sets of tools that many times you might use them in the order that I'm going to talk through them, but you might not. You might just take one tool here and another tool there, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. The first one, though, is empathy, and it's just empathizing with your users, understanding where they're coming from, understanding their experience. And then after you empathize with them, you then define what the challenge is. What is that meaningful problem that's worthy of your effort and your attention? Then you ideate. You come up with many ideas as you possibly can so that you can narrow it down to a handful of ideas that you then prototype and test in this iterative way. And you do that a bunch of times until you get to a solution that has never been thought of before, and it is grounded in what is meaningful to the end user. So I'm going to go through each of these buckets in more detail. But before I do that, I'm going to ask you guys, how many of you here today actually feel creative? How many of you feel like you are in that place where you can bring it? You can bring your excitement and your enthusiasm, and you can do messy work and it can be all wrong. And you can iterate it and be creative. I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to answer this one. Okay, here we go. So 75%, so 3/4 already feel like you're in a creative place, which is like, that is, it's like you have a step, you're a step ahead, because all of the tools that we're going to talk about, all the empathy, define, ideate, prototype, test, become that much easier. And so as I go through the tools and the behaviors in more detail, I want all of you, regardless of how you answered this question, to think about, and maybe even, take notes, grab a pencil, and think about what is it in your environment that allows you to feel, give yourself a sense of permission to be creative in each of these buckets that I'm going to talk through. And maybe conversely, what might get in the way? What gets in the way of you feeling a sense, and maybe giving yourself a sense of permission to experiment with each of these tools and each of these behaviors? There, see, we're only how much? 17 minutes in and you have homework. Okay, so as I mentioned, these tools, empathy, define, ideate, prototype, and test. When folks talk about design thinking, this is usually what they're talking about. And I'm going to go through an example coming up and dig in a bit deeper into each of these so that you can see what it looks like in practical application. But before I do, I want to focus on these behaviors because, as I mentioned earlier, the behaviors, they're really where the magic, kind of where you find the magic, and where the most successful teams find their success. It's when these 6 things are in place. And the first one is having a bias toward action. We are trained to seek approval with a plan in place. We're trained to create this plan, to go in, to get approval for the plan so that we can execute it. And usually there are a couple of decks involved and maybe 3 or 4 meetings with different people to get them on board, and a number of emails that are written up to summarize the plan. Does this sound familiar? I was a project manager for a very long time, and this feels very familiar to me. The challenge is, instead, that's like thinking with our head. It's strategizing. It's putting a plan in place. However, in innovation, we don't know whether this end idea is going to be a good one because it's never been done before. And so the old approach of putting a plan in place, getting permission, and then executing is actually incredibly risky. And so having a bias toward action is a way of thinking with your hands, creating something, testing, iterating. Creating, testing, iterating. And by doing that, you're actually reducing that risk that is inherently there when you're doing big, bold, brand new work. The second one is embracing experimentation. And the chances are you aren't going to get it right the first time. If this is something brand new, you're not going to get it right. It's going to be a little bit off. And so doing something that's never been done, kind of like having this bias toward action and just like taking action and doing it. Embracing experimentation is then iterating. Do it, and then do it differently again, and then do it differently again. So if I go back to this example of project management, the way that I was kind of trained to do it is, if I had a week of time, I would put a plan in place. And I would figure out what I'm going to do on day 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 to get to a final product by day 5. And what we're suggesting is, instead of doing it once over a 5-day period, what if you apply a tight time constraint and do it one full time on Monday, a second time on Tuesday, a third time on Wednesday, and then a fourth on Friday, and a final time, or Thursday, and then a final time on Friday. And so you've experimented your way through problem solving. The third one is kind of like the core of human-centered design or design thinking, and it is solving for the people who are impacted by the problem that we're looking at, and keeping them at the center of the project for the duration of the project, not just at the beginning. Empathy doesn't just happen at the beginning, it happens throughout an entire project, and we keep going back to our end user to understand them better, to see if what we're designing actually fits within their life and is a solution that is desirable. This next one is mindful of process. So I mentioned that design thinking is a team sport. You do it with other people. It's collaborative. And in anything that is collaborative, where there's a lot of risk, it can get emotional. There can be tension. People can be at odds, especially, this next one is radical collaboration, especially when you're intentionally bringing diverse perspectives into the team. And so mindful of process is, it helps us effectively work as a team by making sure that everybody on the team is in the same mindset. And so if we are in a mindset of exploration, and we're out, learning about our user and doing kind of ethnography work, it is helpful for everybody in the team to be in that headspace. If there's one person who's busy problem solving while you're trying to understand the challenge, it actually creates friction. Another great example is during ideation. If you've got a big brainstorm going and you're trying to come up with a lot of ideas, and if I'm busy generating ideas and throwing ideas up on the wall, but one of my teammates is judging those ideas as I'm generating, it's disheartening. And that can only go on for, a couple of times before I'm going to check out. I'm going to stop generating ideas because it feels like, it's fruitless. And so being mindful of process is all about everybody being in the same headspace. And so if we're in a generation mode, everybody is generating. And when it comes time to select and use judgment, then everybody moves to selection and judgment. I've mentioned radical collaboration. And then this last one here is to show versus tell. A lot of times in innovation work, in design work, we need to inspire people to understand where we are, what we're doing, our solution, so that they can either collaborate with us, so that they can support us, or so that they can test what we're designing. And the best way to bring people along or bring people into the work is to create an experience for them so that they can feel what it's like versus just intellectualize. And we do that by showing the project or showing the solution versus telling people about it. There's the old saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Is it 1,000 words or 100,000 words? I don't know. It's worth a lot of words. And that's very true in a design cycle. Okay, so I'm going to have you guys do a quick activity here before I jump back in to going through each of those tool sets with a little more detail. And here's your challenge. I'm going to give you, maybe 60 seconds. So get started whenever you're kind of feel so inclined. But your challenge is, I want you to sketch a new advertising campaign for a hospital pediatric unit. So think about what might you put in the campaign. Maybe there will be like a slogan, or maybe there are some visuals. Maybe where will people see it? Where will it appear? Where will they come into contact with this campaign? Just quickly sketch any idea. Just sketch any idea here. It doesn't have to be right. The good thing about a video conference is I'm not going to force you to show it to anybody else because we can't. So it gets to be private. I'm going to give you about 20 more seconds to just do some sketching. So it is for the pediatric unit. So your end user would be families coming into the hospital. Okay. 5 more seconds. Okay. So I would love, I know that some of you guys are in the chat box, and I would love for those of you that sketched, what was that like? What was it like to sketch an idea, quickly sketch a solution without really a lot of direction from me? Ooh. So I'm, yeah. So I have some folks saying this is, it was stressful. It was kind of fun. Oh, someone else said that did not work for me. I want more information. Someone else said, oh, I want emotions first. Someone else says it was confusing. I kind of agree with all of those. A lot of times, this is how we start a project, is we're given a challenge and we're told to come up with an idea. Come up with an idea and then execute it. And this is not the way human-centered design works. So that was kind of a false start. Sorry, it was a trick. By getting started without even knowing who our user is and spending time with them, it's really hard to design something that's valuable. And so I'm actually going to talk you through an example that comes from one of my friends. So his name is Doug Dietz. And Doug works at GE Healthcare. And he has for many years, he'd kill me if I gave the number of years, but it's a lot of years. He's been there for a long time. He's been in charge of designing their MRI machines. So all of the technical design, all of the kind of the usability of it for the nurses, he is in charge of it. Well, he had this was about 10 years ago now, and he had just released a new version of this MRI machine. And this is an example of what it looked like. And Doug was very proud of it. He had spent many years on this machine. And then he went to a 3-day design thinking session at the Stanford D School. And he had gone through and he had learned a design cycle. And it just by chance, after he had learned the design cycle, he went into a hospital where one of his first machines was installed. And so he was in the hallway when a family walked toward him. There was a mom and there's a dad, and the child, who was the one about to get an MRI, was in the middle. And mom and dad were holding hands with the child. And Doug watched mom and dad exchange a glance above the child's head. And he saw them walk into the room. And as he walked into the room, Doug happened to kind of squat down on one knee, and he was looking into the room, and he was at the level of the patient, the child. And he saw for the first time what a child saw when they walked up to this machine. That he saw a nurse with a mask on. He saw a do not enter sign very close to the machine. He saw all of the scary tools on the walls all over the place and this very white and gray room. And in that moment, Doug realized, I failed. That was his thought. I failed as a designer. I thought that my end user was GE. I thought my end user was the hospital. The end user was that child. And I didn't talk to one child. And so Doug went back to his leadership and he said, I would love to kick off a project to reimagine the experience, the pediatric imaging experience. And you know what his leaders said? Nah, you did a great job. It's a great machine. You nailed it. I'm not sure that's the best use of your time. So when we've got other projects for you. And Doug said, let me do it in my spare time. And they said, you do you. If you want to do it, great, but we're not going to give you money and we're not giving you a team. So you have to figure out how to do it yourself. So the first thing Doug did was he went out and he empathized with his end user. And the way that he did it, he's like, I need to figure out how to talk to children to understand more about their experience. Where am I going to find kids? So he went to the Children's Museum and he put all of this paper down on the floor and he had children and their parents come into this kind of little creative space, and he asked the children to sketch. He asked them to sketch their thoughts and their experiences and things that they loved. And this was a way of getting empathy. He engaged with the children directly. There are other ways of getting empathy as well. There's immersion, where you actually go through the experience yourself as an end user. So if he could have figured out, okay, I'm going to pretend I'm a child and I'm going to go through this experience. So that would be immersion. And then the other is observation. That's another empathetic technique. And that's kind of what Doug did first when he was in the hospital. And he kneeled down and he observed this child going through the experience. So immerse, observe, and engage are these three different kind of categories of how to gain empathy. And through this engagement, Doug realized a couple of things. So this is Doug, by the way. Look at that smile. So what Doug realized is that this experience for children is incredibly scary. It's incredibly scary. And not just for the children, but for the families. What he heard the parents saying is that there's such a high cognitive and emotional load when you're doing this with your child that we forget where we've parked. I don't even remember where my car is because I wasn't even paying attention. And so Doug, when it came to kind of defining the problem, he defined it as like, I wonder if there was a way for us to capitalize on this creative, imaginative capacity of children to lower the fear factor, to make this experience less scary. And so that was the challenge then that Doug set out to accomplish. It was about minimizing fear for these children and using their incredible imaginations that he had kind of seen and realized through that empathy work in the Children's Museum. So when we do define, usually the outcome of the design part or the define part of a design cycle is a concise statement. It's a concise statement that articulates who your user is. So for him, it was, scared families trying to navigate this MRI process. a meaningful problem worth solving. That's the second part of your statement, your defined statement. And then what your intended impact to the end user is if you've solved that problem. So for Doug, it was to make it fun. What if the MRI process was fun? Like, let's just skip acceptable and go straight to incredible. So the next thing that Doug did was he ideated a bunch of ideas with his team. So he generated, I don't even know, hundreds of ideas with his team, and then focused on desirability. So in any good project, there are really three things that you need to nail. Desirability. Have we created something that is desirable to the people that we're serving? Feasibility. So can we do it? And viability. Should we do it? Is it good for our business? And can we do it technically? So the sweet spot is at the center of that Venn diagram. So Doug ideated with his team. He came up with a solution. He's like, okay, so I'm going to prototype. Changing one of these rooms, not the MRI machine itself, but the imagery within the rooms to capitalize on the imagination of the children. And so one of the questions he had asked one of the kids is, if I gave you a blanket and 3 chairs, what is that? Well, what is it? It's a tent with chairs, but to children, it's a spaceship, or it is a castle, or it's a cave, or it's camping, it's a tent. So Doug took that and he thought, you know what? I'm going to create a room that looks like a cozy camp. And so his first round of prototyping was actually sketches, and he would sketch all of this out. And then he went and he put it within, once he kind of had these prototypes done, he moved it into one of the rooms. And this is the final result of one of his first rooms, which is an outer space. It's an outer space room where the child comes in and they are about to have a space adventure. And it's everything from getting a space mission before they even come in. They're invited into this mission. And then there are space suits, and they come in and there are all kinds of outer space imagery around the wall, on the walls. And the MRI machine looks like the spaceship. Now, I don't know if any of you have had to have an MRI, or a child who's had an MRI, but part of what makes it scary is the sound. It's very loud. It's loud. And when you're small and you're all by yourself and you're in a hole, that is scary. And so part of the experience of this room in particular was the story, which was, they would tell the child, so here's the thing. If you sit really still, then it'll start to get louder. And the louder it gets, the faster you're going. And when it's really loud, it means you're going warp speed. Well, as a child, I want to go warp speed. And so they're excited and they're sitting super still so that they can go super fast. The outcome here is that it's fun. It's fun and it's not as scary. And in these rooms that are wrapped with this imagery, they went from 1 sedation a day to 1 sedation a quarter. Now, as a parent, I promise you, I would travel across state lines if it meant that my child maybe wouldn't have to be sedated in this experience. As a hospital, it ends up that the financial impact actually is there as well, because sedation takes time. And so you can schedule more MRIs in one day because each MRI takes less time. So Mandy, the way you put it here, it is brilliant. It's brilliant. And it started by understanding the end user first. Now, if we rewind, remember when Doug went in to his leadership and said, can I do this project? And they said, why? You designed a great machine. The experience works. Why? Well, this is why. There are impacts that we don't even know what they will be when we start a project. But by keeping the end user at the center of the problem, you're creating something that's delightful. And then you're overlaying the business elements to create something that makes sense from a business perspective. I mean, imagine how much it costs to wrap. These are all stickers. Imagine what it costs to wrap the room in stickers. When they were imagining the cost of this project would be maybe a new MRI machine of some other kind, of course they would say no to that. But Doug figured out how to do this in a feasible, viable, and desirable way. So that's a great experience innovation. I'd love to give you guys another example of a marketing campaign that comes from Coca-Cola. So Coca-Cola wanted to figure out a way to celebrate friendship through some sort of an experience that brought friends together. And here is the outcome of that design cycle that they worked on.
My friend, I will love you till the end. And I will share with you everything I have to share. I'll be my woman, my money. When you call me, I'll be there. Cause you're my best friend, you're the one who means something in this world. My friend, I will love you till the end. And I will share with you everything I have to share. My money, when you call me, I'll be there. And I will share with you everything I have to share.
Isn't that sweet? I love that video. The best part was actually the fact that they intentionally designed something that amplified what friendship is about. Friendship is about being there for one another. And so the question that they ask themselves is, how can we design an experience that gives friends an opportunity to be there for one another? And that's how this campaign was born. I'm going to tell you one more story here that comes from Airbnb. So when Airbnb first got started, they struggled at the beginning. They struggled to get listings on the site and for people to believe that it would be a good idea to go into a stranger's house and spend the night there safely. I mean, that is a scary proposition when you first think of it. So one thing that they noticed is that when they looked at their listings, the listings looked a lot like this. This is a real picture from an Airbnb listing. Going back to my prior comment about why it might not be a good idea to stay in some stranger's house. Yuck, that's right, Jeanette. It's like disgusting. And so they thought, okay, this is not a good way to market homes. And so what can we do? And so they thought, okay, let's experiment. Let's fly to New York. They flew to New York and they thought, we're going to hire a professional photographer to take high quality photos, post those photos, and then let's see what happens. Now, they knew that there would never be a business model where they would offer professional photography to every single person who listed on the site. But that wasn't what they were testing. They weren't testing the feasibility and viability of it. They were testing what happens if the photos are high quality. So they went, they did this, they took incredible photos, posted those photos. And what they noticed when photos went to that to this, which is also a real Airbnb listing, it dramatically changed the marketability of those postings. And so really it took a different type of photo. And so once they figured out that, okay, yeah, photos actually do make a really big difference in people's trust, that it is a safe experience, then they could overlay the feasibility and viability and figure out, okay, how can we get professional quality photos without the price? And they've learned how to teach people the staging and the setup that's required to create beautiful imagery that feels believable and like it's trustworthy. So lastly, how do you apply this? So I've gone through a couple of, a deep example with Doug, Coca-Cola, Airbnb. How do you apply this at work? How do you just get started? And the first thing is I'd love you to identify a challenge that you would like to explore. Anything. It could be at work, it could be at home, it could be with the faith community, it could be with your kids' school. It's just, what is a question that you have that you don't know the answer to? And a human is impacted by it. So that's number one. Number two is, who is that human? Who is that user? And describe them. If I'm doing something for my kids' school, maybe I'm designing for the people dropping off their children at the beginning of the day. Maybe that's my user. So you identify your user. And then the next thing is, what do you want to learn from them? So if I go back to this school example, maybe I want to learn, what does it feel like to do the handoff with the teachers? Because I'm trying to figure out how to improve that handoff process. And it should be open-ended. It's not like, does it feel good? Does it feel bad? Because that doesn't get us any information. Remember, this is empathy. We want to feel what they are feeling. We want to understand their experience. And then schedule time to talk with them, ideally in person. Just have a couple of conversations. And those 2 conversations, or 3, or however many, will offer you incredibly new insights. If you are listening and hearing what they are saying with an empathetic mindset. What we found is, generally speaking, when we're doing empathy interviews, it takes only 6 empathy interviews with our user, with our core user, to start to uncover the themes. Not very many. This is definitely not quantitative research. It is qualitative. So that's how I would recommend taking your first step as you begin to apply the design thinking tools and behaviors. And also find a partner. Do it with someone. This is work that is collaborative. And even from the very empathy interviews to the testing, doing it with a team or at least with a partner is radically more successful than trying to go it alone. Selma, I might pass it back over to you now for some Q&A. If folks have any questions that they have been grappling with, either as I've been talking or that you've grappled with as you've tried to apply design thinking.
Yes, thank you so much, Anna. We have tons of questions. I will start with Stacy's. She is asking if your team incorporates any research from cognitive psychology into your design thinking work. If you do, if you can share some examples.
So yes, I would say whether it's cognitive psychology work, understanding how the brain works and how people think. So that is often a good overlay to empathy interviews. Another good overlay is quantitative data. Sometimes you use quantitative data to help identify where the challenges are that you want to focus on. Then you go through and you talk with users. You understand their unique perspective, their experiences. Then you'll overlay other types of research. Depending on the challenge, there are all different types of research that you might overlay at that point. How our brains work might be what you overlay at that point. You do iterative testing. And then we also like to overlay quantitative data again at the very end to look at how to roll it out and scale it effectively.
All right, wonderful. We have a question from Jessica, Anna, and she references the Coke commercial that you showed, and she mentioned how ideas like that are fantastic when they're approved and when we see them actually being used. But her question is, how many of these standout ideas are shot down because of fear of being different? And what advice do you have for designers to overcome the constant rejections?
Such a good question. Here's what I would say, and do this at your own risk. So I would say ask for feedback versus permission. The minute that we go in to ask for permission, it engages the judgmental nature of the person who's giving permission. And by nature, they're going to try to reduce the risk and figure out what won't work about the idea. However, if you prototype and test something and you bring it in and say, you know what, actually, I've done some really low resolution prototype testing. Here's the solution. This is what we know from our end users. I would love to get your input on how to identify a larger group of people for us to test it with.
All right, wonderful. A lot of questions to still go through, so I'm going to try to get to them all, Anna. If we do not, we will provide them all to you and figure out a way to continue this conversation offline. We have Carrie, and the question is, how does this process change when you have multiple users? Do you go through the process for each, or try to come up with one solution that applies to them all?
That's a really good question. So usually what we will do is we'll start with a global design challenge that allows for flexibility. So when we go out and conduct empathy interviews, we'll intentionally talk with multiple audiences if multiple audiences are impacted. So for example, if we're looking at performance management, maybe we'll do it with the different audiences who are impacted by performance management. And then we might create a different point of view. So in that define bucket, we'll create a different point of view statement for the different audiences. And then we'll create a portfolio approach to the problem solving. And so we almost always are testing multiple prototypes at the same time. It's a version of flaring that then will allow us to focus in on just the right ideas. And so you might actually find that there's one solution in the end that applies to everyone, but there might be multiple solutions that you end up implementing. And so we do that by starting with multiple point of views.
Right, fantastic. And are you able to share some examples of B2B design thinking for services versus products?
Yes. So the first one that comes to mind is the health insurance. So working within the health insurance industry, so a big health insurer, then they work with their partners to deliver services to the end user. And so the challenge is your end user often, while you might be delivering it to another business, their end user is a human being. And so I would say that there is a slippery slope sometimes of thinking you're designing for that business you're selling to, when actually you might be, your end user might be the human on the other side of them.
Right. Wonderful. And Carrie is just asking for a little bit of clarification about the defining statement.
Yes. Okay. So usually it's flexible. Different people do it different ways. So there really isn't a recipe that I would say is universally the right way. The way that I've been doing it lately, there are 4 different statements that come together and read as one. And each statement is about 1 sentence or 2 sentences. So it starts with, we met, ... And you describe who the user is that you met. The second one is, surprisingly, we learned. What is that surprising new insight that is a meaningful problem that's worthy of solving? Then the third one is, we wonder if this means. This is where you're making a leap of inference. You're starting to pick apart that insight you uncovered to dig into it a bit deeper. So this is often not something that was said by the end user, but a level deeper. And then the last one is, we think it would be game-changing if. And this is your aspiration. It's not yet a solution, but it is the intended outcome. If your solution that you design is incredibly successful, what is the intended outcome to your end user? So you take those 4 statements, and then they almost can read off in one breath. If it takes more than one breath, you might have too many words.
All right, good advice. We have Ozge here, and she is wondering if you have any recommendations for further reading, especially if it's academic oriented.
Yes. So 2 great places to go, I would say. The Stanford D-School website, they have lots of materials that I think are pretty incredible, but I'm biased, so warning you. The other, IDEO also has a bunch of free materials that you can use and leverage to learn more about design thinking. There's also a couple of great HBR articles. If you just search human-centered design, or I think it's design thinking, and the Harvard Business Review. I would also say that the absolute best way to learn design thinking is to do it. Do it, do it. Reading about it is, it's a good way to kind of wrap your head around what it is. It does not help you figure out how to use it to affect the world and to make it a better place. So I promise you, you will do it imperfectly. Just because I've been doing this full time for 10 years and I still do it imperfectly, but the act of practicing is what's important.
All right, wonderful. Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I will help you out with one question, Anna. A lot of people are asking for the recording, the slides, I have good news. This will be available on demand immediately after we conclude. So you can go back, take additional notes. I know a lot of people have had a lot of questions about points that you had made. And then the slides will be available in the resources space at the end of the event. So thank you so much, Anna, for your time. Your presentation was incredibly powerful, and I loved seeing all of the comments. Again, as I promised, we'll provide all of the other questions to Anna and figure out a way to continue this conversation. But for now, we have to say goodbye to her, unfortunately, but I hope that everyone joins me in 15 minutes for our next presentation. While we're waiting for the next presentation, please feel free to go to the exhibit spaces, play trivia, collect badges, and continue connecting with your peers. Thank you so much, and I'll see you soon. And thank you,
Bye,
Anna,
everyone.
again.